The Czech Republic is home to many amazing zoos, and the zoo in Liberec is not one of them, unfortunately. I'll say it straight, today the focus is mainly on problems, because even though not everything is bad here, there are quite a few serious issues. Things are starting to improve, and thankfully there is even a master plan, but that is very much needed here, because as things stand, Liberec is unfortunately the worst zoo I've visited in the Czech Republic so far. And that is especially disappointing considering we're in the country's oldest zoo today. So let's take a closer look at just how bad things really are and what urgently needs to change. And at the end, we'll also see whether a visit is still worth it or not. Liberec is located in the north of the Czech Republic, not far from the tri-border region with Germany and Poland. The zoo sits on the edge of the city in a small valley within the municipal forest and covers a total area of around 14 hectares. Since 2014, the entrance has been located on the eastern side of the zoo, and the entrance building itself reflects that with a fairly modern appearance. Once inside, you might think my introduction was a bit of an exaggeration, because the hoofstock enclosures on the right actually make a pretty decent first impression as well. Sure, the facade is starting to crumble a bit behind the Blessbock, but the adjacent Bactrian camel enclosure even feels quite modern and is genuinely very well done. And up to the Nyala enclosure, there's really not much to complain about. But then we reach the Elephant House. In this enclosure, coatis are kept together with lowland tapirs, and while it feels solid enough for the white-nosed coatis, it is ultimately a bit too small for tapirs in my opinion. There is at least a decent pool for them to cool off in, but depending on the position of the sun, there is a lack of proper shaded areas as well. And then there was Bala, a single female elephant kept in what is clearly a completely outdated enclosure. During our visit, she seemed to stand in almost the exact same spot for hours, continuously rolling pellets out of a ball. I'm not sure how much enrichment is really left in that. Bala is a former East German circus elephant and was very submissive in zoo settings afterwards, making it difficult to integrate her into a group. She was transferred from Münster to Liberec in 2013 to accompany an elderly elephant, but that one passed away in 2021. Since then, the zoo has been looking for a suitable solution for her, and a look into the indoor facilities of the house, which dates back to 1972, makes it even clearer why I'm relieved that a solution has now been found and that elephant keeping in Liberec will soon be phased out. Bala is expected to be moved to the United Kingdom in September of this year, and Skanderwell might not be a traditional sanctuary, but rather a religious community with temples and elephants, but she should continue to receive the specialized care she needs there, especially given her additional health issues. Here in Liberec, I'm hoping that once she has left, the entire building and the outer area will be redeveloped for the tapirs and coatis. For the giraffes and zebras, renovation work is now already in full swing and is expected to be completed by autumn. So what you're seeing here is still the old enclosure, which dates back to the 1980s. Shortly after we visited, the giraffes were transferred to other zoos and the zebras are currently being housed with the Blessbock. And especially if we step inside here for a moment and then look through the glass upstairs, the view into the indoor giraffe enclosure really shows quite clearly why a modernization was necessary. At the same time, I'm actually glad I got to experience it like this, because architecturally the building was definitely interesting. I honestly can't think of another older giraffe house that offered this kind of perspective on the animals. Back in the 1980s, that must have been quite unique. And finding a stair lift here was also Not something I would have expected, to be honest. Outside, there was another elevated viewing point, this time without a lift, and when we compare the view of the old enclosure from here to the concept images, it almost feels like the upgrade is mainly visual. But the space is supposed to be expanded and include a variety of different substrates, so let's wait and see. If any one of you is currently watching this in the future, having seen it after it was completed, let me know what you think in the comments. When we turn around on the viewing platform, we are looking across the path at a fairly solid take-in enclosure. More specifically, it's home to golden tarkins. But just like with the Przewalski horses behind them, these are of course not large-scale modern hoofstock habitats, and the reindeer enclosure isn't exactly going to win awards either. All of it is not bad, but also not great. There's also an interesting little hut there where you can take a look into the zoo's past. The only catch is, a lot of what you see here still exists in slightly altered form, and we will come across it again later on the route. Doesn't that get you excited? But first we are heading to one of the newest additions, the Kia Aviary. Opened in 2023, this breeding facility cost the equivalent of around 330,000 euros, and the result is definitely solid, even if it's not visually spectacular. The Zoo Expo building is another one of the more modern structures, dating back to 2015. It's used for talks and presentations, and since May of 2023, it also houses an exhibition on tropical frogs. Alongside some fairly common poison dart frogs, there are also a few more unusual species to discover, like the Sambava tomato frog or the Cranwell's horned frog. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to spot some of the rarest species. According to Zootierliste, both the fringed leaf frog and the La Palma glass frog are only kept here in all of Europe. That said, there's more than just frogs in the terrariums. For example, there's an adorable Willem's electric blue gecko. There was also a three-banded armadillo on display, although I really hope that was only a temporary arrangement. Other than that, however, this is a really cool exhibit. Nothing much to complain about here. Back outside, the path now leads us back to the giraffes again, and beyond them we reach another enclosure, this time for roan antelope. From here the trail heads downhill, and to the left we can look into the enclosure of the giant anteaters. Unfortunately, they didn't make an appearance. Further along the slope, there are additional hoofstock enclosures that I actually liked quite a bit, especially the habitat for the relatively rarely kept Bucara macaque is beautiful naturalistic. It always helps when the terrain can be used to its full potential. Down in the valley, this exhibit didn't really feel like an island enclosure anymore during my visit, and from a distance I could only just make out the black lemur. Beyond that, the path continues along a large body of water towards the historic entrance, which used to be the zoo's main access point. The pelicans definitely have plenty of space here. Since this path is a dead end, we turn back pretty quickly and reach a row of aviaries on the other side, where the park railway also passed by. These aviaries house several eagles and vultures, such as bearded vultures, Egyptian vultures and Steller sea eagles, which are of course especially impressive at such a close range. The zoo is actually known for breeding birds of prey, so there's a lot to see here, but personally I would prefer it if 2 or 3 aviaries were combined to provide more space with a reduced number of species. That being said, thanks to the natural surroundings, this is still a very pleasant area for visitors. A little further along, somewhat hidden by the overgrown vegetation, there's also another real rarity to discover: the beautiful black-necked cranes. They're only kept in about 10 places across Europe, at least when we exclude Russia. And then we reach the part that really makes Zoo Liberec look outdated. On the right is the Carnivore House, which was last comprehensively renovated in 1994, so over 30 years ago, and that's exactly how it looks when you peer into the enclosures. Neither the size, nor the furnishing, nor the overall structure meet modern standards, although to be fair, the lion does have at least a small pool, which was empty. The shortcomings are so obvious in my opinion that I don't really need to go into detail. The best part is probably the one lion enclosure along the slope, where the Barbary lion at least have a bit more space and structure, and from the elevated platform he can at least keep a good watch over his surroundings. I couldn't say for sure whether all of these enclosures are currently occupied, but if you could connect the 5 big cat enclosures for rotational use and also definitely add a lot more furnishing, you could probably create something at least acceptable with the existing structure as a temporary solution. The house itself was closed during my visit for technical reasons, but luckily my friend Sven visited later, so I can still give you an impression of the inside. Unsurprisingly, it's not exactly modern. There is, however, one small but noteworthy surprise, because Etruscan shrews are only kept in 9 zoos worldwide, all of them in Europe. In terms of big cats, besides the Barbary lions, there's also an elderly white tigress. Starting in 1994, breeding them here was once a point of pride, but today it's viewed much more critically. White tigers aren't a separate species bred for conservation purposes, but rather the result of targeted inbreeding, often associated with significant health issues. As a result, fewer and fewer zoos are willing to continue this practice, including Liberec, where this one will probably be the last white tiger you can see here. The Sri Lankan rusty spotted cat is another much smaller feline species kept in the house. It was actually the only cat I saw being active during my visit, which made me really happy, especially since they are species you also do not get to see very often. And compared to the others, its enclosure is actually quite decent. A little off the hillside enclosure of the lions, there's also this very modest enclosure for Humboldt penguins. It has been built in 1982 and apparently remained largely unchanged since then. However, when Sven visited later, it was empty, so something is finally happening here. Opposite the Carnivore House, there is also a fairly similar looking primate exhibit. Here I saw a species I had probably never encountered before. At the moment, golden-bellied mangabeys can only be found in 11 zoos across Europe. But as you can see, the animals may be beautiful, their enclosure is not. But once we step into the tropical house, things immediately take a turn for the better. Downstairs we are greeted by a series of genuinely nice and fairly spacious terrariums. Among others, you can see green tree monitors, a blue spotted tree monitor, Fiji banded iguanas, blue-tongued skinks, caiman lizards, and even an enormous reticulated python. And I think you can immediately tell that this building is a bit newer, even though it also already opened in 2000. And parts of it have been modernized over time. In 2020, for example, several enclosures on the upper floor were combined to give the birds that live there more space. Compared to free flight setups in large tropical halls, the ground pigeons still do not have an enormous amount of room, but that's an unfair comparison for any bird here, also including species like the Bali myna. Interestingly, there is also a free-flying bird in the hall, a single falcon. That's very unusual, and it honestly confused me quite a bit. I'm sure the number of species have been reduced here, but there still are quite a few interesting species to see. Alongside the hyacinth macaws, there are no fewer than 4 species of hornbills. Black-crested hornbills, Visayan pterictic hornbills, Papuan hornbills, and silvery-cheeked hornbills. So within a fairly atmospheric tropical setting, you get an interesting mix of birds and reptiles. The terrariums mostly convinced me, and a few of the hornbill enclosures are actually well above average. Not only are their indoor spaces quite tall and only viewable from the ground floor, they also have newly modernized outdoor aviaries which look excellent in Sven's footage. During my visit, those upgrades were still in full progress. However, Sven's report confirms my concern that the birds on the opposite side of the building fare significantly worse by comparison. Their indoor enclosures are located above the terrariums and are therefore only about half as tall, and the species kept there, including the Papuan hornbills, apparently don't have access to any outdoor aviaries at all. That's quite a stark difference in terms of animal husbandry. Still, at least parts of the tropical house are genuinely good. But can the same be said about the Primate House right behind the Gibbon Bistro? Well, the first animals we encounter are, of course, the ones that gave the bistro its name, and during my visit the white-cheeked gibbons even had an adorable baby. Their outdoor enclosure isn't particularly large in terms of the ground space, but it does offer decent height and makes good use of the vertical space with its climbing structures. You can also tell that an originally separated enclosure was later merged into it. This is even more apparent in the neighboring enclosure, home to the beautiful Diana monkeys. If you look closely to the ground here, you can still spot traces of what used to be a much more subdivided setup. I'm sure when this house opened in 1995, there were probably more than twice as many species here, including orangutans, which were kept here until at least 2015. The indoor enclosure for the smaller primates were expanded and modernized just a few years ago, and I do think that's quite noticeable. The visitor areas and educational elements were also updated, so the building perhaps doesn't make a bad impression at first. But if you're wondering why I specifically mentioned the smaller primates, the chimpanzees provide the answer. After Kuba, a 40-year-old male, had to be euthanized in 2025 due to a tumor, 3 females remain, at least 2 of them already quite old. So I thought this would become a retirement group for older chimpanzees, with the exhibit eventually phased out. Because alongside the indoor space, which is mediocre at best, the outdoor enclosure unfortunately isn't much better. The sloped terrain does help a bit, I guess, and it's certainly not the worst chimpanzee enclosure I've ever seen, but I still find it rather questionable that the website suggested that they might consider breeding again with the new male. I mean, yes, there are some enrichment features like an artificial termite mound, but once more, I don't think I need to explain that this doesn't meet modern standards. As a retirement home, it may be acceptable, but I would only want to see a new breeding group in Liberec if they get a completely new facility. In this shot you can see quite clearly that the chimpanzee outdoor enclosure is located just behind this sea-lined exhibit, and you've probably already noticed that this one isn't exactly modern either. At the moment, there's only one single male South American sea lion living here. As social animals, sea lions obviously shouldn't be kept alone long term, but whether he's going to be relocated or given new companions, I don't know. The rest of the valley area is also very much a mix of highs and lows. The meerkat enclosure, for instance, is absolutely solid, as is the adjacent tortoise enclosure, but when it comes to the flamingos behind them, as always with open enclosures like this, you can argue about the practice of wing clipping. The next real low point, however, is the Hamadryas baboon enclosure, which is a relatively small cage that feels really cramped. And I have so much footage here and I could talk about this for several minutes, but I just don't know why, because everything seems very obvious here. I think the images just really speak for themselves. Way better, on the other hand, is the enclosure of the Yucatan margay. Not only does it offer a decent amount of space, but it's also well furnished with dense vegetation and good climbing structures. It's just a shame that none of the animals made an appearance, because with only 26 zoos keeping them in Europe, you don't get many chances to see this species. But hey, at least I spotted the plain Swiss Kashas in their indoor enclosure. These are only kept in 9 zoos across of Europe. Finally, I have to briefly talk about the old polar bear enclosure you're looking at right now. And no, this isn't a joke. They really did keep polar bears here, according to Zootierliste up until 1975. Well, compared to that, everything here looks totally great, but that's a very questionable benchmark. At the edge of the slope, we now make our way out of the valley, passing some more modern aviaries for snowy owls and Eurasian great grey owls. A bit further up, passing the chimpanzee enclosure once again, there is also a red panda exhibit built into the hillside next to the lion enclosure. Definitely one of the better enclosures in the zoo, nothing spectacular but nicely integrated into the slope. To a certain degree, this also applies to the snow leopard enclosures above, but given the rather limited space, I'd honestly rather see palace cats in here. And since the enclosures are covered in mesh, couldn't there at least be a few elevated platforms? If you can't even provide that, yeah, well, sorry, but this is one of the worst snow leopard enclosures I have ever seen. Even further up than this, there are also additional enclosures that house North Chinese leopards. And I'll be completely honest with you. At this point in the video, I feel exactly the same way I did during my visit. I've had enough. I just want to get out of here and focus on things that don't leave me feel drained. I really do try to stay constructive and fair, but I'm worn out. I mean, if you combined all of these 3 enclosures and properly furnished them with climbing structures for a single cat, fine. But like this? No. Just no. And I genuinely hope the people responsible at the zoo are nodding along right now, glad that somebody is saying it, because I don't necessarily think it's the fault of the current staff on site, of course. But I still vividly remember how I felt seeing this enclosure, and after everything else, this was just one bad enclosure too much. I just wanted to leave. I had enough of this zoo. So, fortunately, we now finish things off by looping around the back of the modern ungulate enclosures near the entrance. I had already spotted a single separated Somali wild ass earlier, but now the rest of the herd was visible on the much larger main enclosure. And thankfully, I don't have much to complain about with the other hoofstock enclosures either. Here you will find East Caucasian Turs, and also Northern Blue Sheep, which, being kept in only 9 collections outside of Asia and Russia, are another real rarity. Finally, there's the spacious South America exhibit, where Rheas and Vicuñas should have a good life. Man, I'm glad that's over. Time to take a breath. Okay. Usually I don't channel negative aspects in an emotional way, but here I really felt the need to convey the feeling I had towards the end of my visit. By the time I reached the leopard enclosures, I was simply done with the zoo. The only thing that softened my view was the outlook of the master plan, which at least offers some hope for change. But emotional reactions are easy, and you're hopefully here for a more measured assessment. And in that regard, I do want to make one thing clear. Zoo Liberec is not a disaster zoo that deserves to be shut down or something like that. We're still talking about a zoo that, as a member of EASA and VASA, is naturally involved in conservation efforts. That ranges from financial support for numerous conservation projects to breeding programs and even reintroductions. Especially when it comes to birds of prey, the zoo has done genuinely valuable conservation work that deserves recognition. Education also seems to be taken seriously here. And beyond the master plan as a promise for the future, there are already completed modernization projects within the zoo, as well as ongoing constructions like the giraffe exhibit. Even the decision to part with the elephant shows a willingness to act in the interest of animal welfare. So yes, the will to change is there, but it's also very much needed. And that's likely because the financial resources for modernization over the past 25 years haven't exactly been abundant. Even the widely promoted master plan project Valley of Threatened Wilderness is described on the architect's website as focusing on relatively cheap large natural exhibition spaces, because money still doesn't grow on trees here. However, the project aims to nearly double the zoo's size by adding 13 hectares with a focus on species from colder regions. The highlight will likely be a new enclosure for Siberian tigers, shifting away from the breeding of white tigers in favor of a more conservation-focused approach. That all sounds promising, and the concept images certainly look impressive. My concern, however, is that this new area doesn't really address the existing issues, so a lot of important questions remain. What's the plan for the chimpanzees and the sea lions? Are there any concrete ideas for the baboons? And while I've since learned that something new is being planned for the Chinese leopards, what about the snow leopards? What's their future supposed to look like? Is the zoo willing to part with other flagship species, as it was with the elephants, if it can't provide them with modern enclosures? These are crucial questions for the future of the zoo, and hopefully progress can be made sooner rather than later. Because all the good intentions don't change the fact that there are still too many enclosures here that are clearly outdated, and some of the current holdings simply shouldn't continue like this for much longer. So in the end, right now I can only recommend a visit if you are prepared to experience a few genuinely uncomfortable moments. But at the same time, there are definitely positive aspects here that are worth appreciating. If you do visit in the future, feel free to let me know how the new giraffe enclosure turned out, or whether anything else has improved. I'll certainly be keeping an eye on the development here and would be happy to return in a few years to see how things have progressed. In any case, I wish the people in charge all the best in pushing forward the already visible positive changes as quickly as possible. But for now, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to share your thoughts on the zoo, the individual enclosures, or of course, the master plan. And if you liked the video, I really appreciate a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and join me on my journey through the zoos of Europe and maybe soon the entire world. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time. Yours truly, Martin.